All right, we're going to get started with our webinar for today. My name is Jeff Pickett. I'm the Director of Marketing and Outreach for HealthPoint at Dakota State University. And today we're going to talk about disaster recovery and some of the steps that you can take to safeguard your system. With us today on the call is Dan Friedrich, who's the Director of HealthPoint. Dan has 30 years of experience in IT and in security. Also on our call today is Brian Mitchell. Brian has 20 years of IT experience and most recently came from the healthcare sector of GE and is now the Vice President of Sales with ClearData. And I'm going to turn this presentation over to Dan here. If you have any questions, feel free to type those in. We'll also have a question and answer session at the end where we'll turn the microphones on and let everybody have a dialogue if they prefer. But with no further ado, I'm going to change the presentation screen over to Dan and let him take it from there.
As Jeff said, I've got about 30 years in security, starting off in the U.S. Navy a lot of years ago. You know, and this problem, what that's given me, and certainly not the same kind of focused attention on disaster recovery that Brian has, and he'll speak to some of those things. But what it does give me is it gives me a pretty good backdrop into the evolution of business continuity planning, the importance of it, you know, where did we come from, where are we going, those kinds of things. And so I have a lot of that kind of background as well as the privacy and security aspects of it. How do we keep that information safe? How do we make sure that going forward the business side of it is always able to be on track? I'm picking up a little bit of an echo from somebody. I'm not sure if it's me or if somebody maybe has their mic. If they do happen to have their mic open and they're listening via computer, would you please just close that, hit the mute button on your microphone? I appreciate it. Thanks. Sounds better now. So we'll spend about the next hour roughly talking about quite a few things. You know, we're going to talk about what the current situation is, some of the stark realities that you may not know about business continuity, and things that are actually happening today. We'll spend a little bit of time. For some of you, business continuity might be a new phrase. You know, a lot of times we talk about disaster recovery or those kinds of things, but that has really evolved over the last 30 years, and you'll see in a couple of later slides the difference between what was traditionally called disaster recovery, you know, is moving into much more of a how do I keep my business up all the time. Let's make this less of a backroom operation, more of an upfront. What kinds of things do we do to make sure that the customer never realizes that we've had a glitch? So we're going to spend some time defining business continuity. We'll spend a little bit of time with the cost of business interruptions. I mean, you know, this is as important in healthcare as it is in any business, and probably more so in a lot of respects. There are not very many business segments outside of healthcare that are literally life on the line kind of thing. So what is the real cost of a business interruption? What happens if you can't see patients? What happens if you can't get timely information on patients? Those kinds of things. We'll give you some tools. We won't do a lot of time spending assessing your business safety, but we'll help you start to understand some of the tools that are available for you to do those kinds of things. And then we will explore a lot of different ways that you can protect your business. And about midway through the presentation, I'll start talking about, or stop talking about a lot of these background things, and I'll turn it over to Brian, who has a lot of specific expertise in disaster recovery and business continuity. So I think the plan here is to give you as much information in this hour as we can. So we'll start with kind of a history lesson, and we'll start also with some things that you should be asking yourself. You know, what does your business continuity planning team look like? Have you really done anything? Some of you are probably old enough to remember Y2K, others might not be. I'm certainly old enough to remember it. I remember the run-up to it in 98 and 99, people scrambling to make sure that they were Y2K compliant. For those of you who might not know what that was about, that stems all the way back from the 60s when all the programmers figured that a 2-year date change would be plenty because they could always just assume that 1900 was in front of the additional years. So, of course, when the year 2000 came, there was much teeth gnashing, everything from local governments to healthcare organizations to the federal government trying to decide what are we going to do when all of a sudden we need 4-digit things. Massive effort to make sure that programs were up and running. IT departments across the country had weeks of time without sleep, and it was all about preparing for a disaster that, quite frankly, never materialized. So it was never everything they were worried about that it would be, but I believe that part of the reason why it was never as bad as the doomsday people predicted was because everyone was scared enough of it that they really did a lot of planning, and the people that did actually have a problem knew about it and corrected it before the thing came. And so there's a valuable lesson there too, in that preparedness in this case almost prevented the disaster. So when you think about business continuity, we're going to talk today about some proactive things that you can do as opposed to reactive, which is the more traditional sense of disaster recovery. So one of the surest ways, if you look around your organization, if there's a budget line item that says business continuity, you can be sure of the business's commitment to that. You know, if there is no line item attached, and I'm not talking about the line item for the tape backup device or the on-site NAS storage or things like that, I'm talking about, does the business continuity group have a budget in both time and dollars so that you can do the appropriate amount of planning, you can do the things that are necessary to be prepared to keep your business flowing if something happens. Couple of questions to ask yourself, of course. How much of this can be avoided completely? And what steps can we take proactively to stop that disaster from happening? How many things, if we do them right, whether it's hosting on-site or whether it's hosting off-site, or if we have multiple locations, is there some kind of distribution between the sites? What is our backup plan? What's the strategy? How many of these things can be avoided? And then at some level we have to, when we balance dollars against resources, you know, dollars or time, if we balance those things against the danger of it happening, at some point you have to say to yourself, well, I can absorb this much, because in order to get me to 100% protection, it might be cost prohibitive. But if I can get to 95% protection and then just understand what our tolerance is for that remainder, we'll be good to go. So those are a few questions. I'll ask them again at the end, but you just be kind of thinking about those things. So there are definitely some do's and don'ts as we move forward. You know, some of you that are more familiar with disaster recovery probably understand a few of these concepts. If you're new to this at all, there are certain things that maybe you're making assumptions about, or certainly your non-technical people may be making assumptions about. Learning the capabilities of the hardware and software that you use is critically important to this. Don't assume that you know. Really understand what that means, and that means running practice drills. That means doing other kinds of things like that. Understand what it is that your business needs to have happen in a business continuity plan, and test. How long does it take to recover? How long? And keep in mind, when you start doing these drills and you're going to be doing a recovery drill, that is under the best case scenario, right? So when you do a drill, you're likely, in the event of a real disaster, to be dealing with other issues as well. So give yourself that safety factor in there. If it takes you 4 hours to recover and you say that our recovery objective has to be 6 hours, you might feel like you're in good shape because you've tested it and it takes you 4, but I guarantee you in a real world emergency it won't happen as fast as your test goes, because that test is happening under real controlled environment, if you will. Also try to understand where it is that you're going to be going 5 years from now or 10 years from now, because this is not necessarily a cheap endeavor, and it's certainly not, from a time perspective, a low effort so you'll want to plan for that growth up front. There's also a lot of things not to do, right? And a couple of really big ones here, of course, is assuming that recovery will work, because it doesn't always. You need to test that. You need to test it thoroughly. Another real gotcha on this page is that notion that something is better than nothing. It almost couldn't be farther from the truth in this sense, because when you say something is probably better than nothing, if I'm taking backup tapes off-site and storing them at the bank location, that might in fact be better than nothing, but your end users and your providers are probably more in the sense that we're doing everything we need to do to make sure that our business continuity plan is in place. So when you say something is better than nothing, as a technical person, your providers and your end users are hearing everything's taken care of. So those are not the same messages, and oftentimes then when an actual disaster happens, those messages get crossed. So you know, that notion of something is better than nothing is just not right. And then there's also this last point on this slide, actually, normal recovery. If somebody accidentally deletes a file and an administrator's got to go back and get that file, that would be like normal recovery. That is not disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is what happens when in a place like Joplin, Missouri, the roof blows off the hospital. And then you have a whole different set of things that have to happen there. Ron Fovarg, if some of you were lucky enough to get to our eHealth Summit last year, he was here and he led the effort to bring that hospital back up from after that tornado. And he said there's just so many things that you never think about in your disaster recovery drill. One of the things that stuck out in my mind from his conversation was we had a lot of things in place technically, but we didn't have the simplest things that are required to run a hospital. We had to order porta potties in to the parking lot so we could set up a tent so we could begin recovery operations. So all of those kinds of things have to happen at the same time that you're bringing your IT systems back up. And so understanding that disaster recovery is really that worst case scenario, and that requires planning. You'll hear Brian say a little later that you know, not only will you be looking for porta potties, but probably everybody in your immediate area will be looking for porta potties too. So you know, having some of those even could go so far as to say, in the event of a natural disaster that's widespread, we want this many of this type of facility. So, you know, as we look at some of the realities of what happens to businesses, if there's a real disaster, and this slide and the next slide have very slightly different numbers, but essentially they're the same thing. Half of the companies that lose their data through a disaster never reopen their doors. That's a staggering amount. And even worse than that, within the following 2 years, if it was truly a complete disaster and they never got back up right, they were out of business within 2 years. So you know, 9 out of 10, that's an awful lot of risk assumed there. This slide essentially has the same numbers presented in a different format. You know, their window wasn't immediately, it was over a period of 6 months, so roughly 60% or somewhere again about that half number. really just can never recover, and that's the point. If there's no planning in place, you're basically hoping that the disaster never happens. Recreating data from scratch now, and keep in mind what we're talking about here. This is the time involved. It is the amount of people involved in making this happen. It is trying to track down those things. That's $2,000 to $8,000 per megabyte, and that's an awful big number. As you realize, in today's world of terabyte hard drives and those kinds of things, and those are real costs. You know, Gartner's probably put together a better thing that's more real to more people. You know, if you have a true disaster and it wipes out everything on your computer networks and you have to rebuild all that stuff, the hourly cost of downtime starts to really get to be high for you. And a couple of things that we think about is, you know, sure, we have hardware failure. There's a hard drive that goes down. But a third of the problems that we create on networks are created by our own internal human errors, whether it's an inadvertent deletion of something, whether it's an inadvertent tripping over a power cord, whatever it is. There's a lot of costs for data loss. Now, all of those might not be disasters in that traditional sense, but certainly they could be. So when we start to focus in a little bit more on healthcare, you know, we've come up with some data. It's a couple years old, but I think it's pretty darn close in that SIC, or that specific industrial sector for healthcare and social care. People recognize that weather and data breaches are the big ones there. You know, 7 out of 10 people, and we are certainly in that category of weather. You know, whether it's a large-scale event like a snowstorm or a blizzard that can potentially shut down travel and those kinds of things for periods of time, to those smaller, focused, more destructive things like a tornado. You know, I mean, in the next 60 days, anybody listening to this phone call could get hit by a tornado. And that's just the reality. And when we think it doesn't happen, you know, just the events in the last couple of years have shown that it really does, and it really does happen to healthcare. So you can either be prepared for it or just accept what's going to happen. The third item on there really is that things that really are kind of beyond our control, but you need to be thinking about. If you're adopting an EMR system, you're putting the lifeblood of that organization in the hands of IT, you need to understand just how stable your local ISP is. That becomes even more important if you're hosting outside, but that local ISP, and how do I get there? Is there multiple ways to get out to the world? So those are things to really pay attention to too, and as you're going. So I told you that we would do a little bit about a history lesson here. So when we think about the difference between the way things were back in the 80s and up through that dot-com boom and today, you know, back in the 80s when there wasn't a lot of desktops, for example, all of those were kind of backroom, server-side. The data center did all of the backups and recovery, and end users were using dumb terminals or maybe a terminal emulation program, and they turned it on, and if it didn't show the screen they were expecting to see, they called somebody, right? So, and then it was generally taken care of. Well, and all that really meant was, can we get to a point where our users can see our screen again? And we talked a lot about tape backup in those days. We talked a lot about how long will it take us? What's our recovery time objective? At what point can we bring everything back up within 4 hours or 6 hours? Do we need to have multiple tape drives so we can be dumping data back on in a different format? That kind of changed a little bit into the 90s, but not a ton. I mean, it became more important for people because they needed a little more high availability during the dot-com era, you know, and mostly because there was a lot of companies that if you didn't, you couldn't go anyplace. There was no bricks and mortar. So that started to change that downwards, and that recovery time started to become shorter and shorter and shorter because people just couldn't afford to be without things for days or hours at a time. You know, early part of this century and certainly today, with the way businesses are run and healthcare is run, you have to be up. I mean, you know, there's not an option of being down for hours and those kinds of things. You know, your competition drives that. The fact that you're going to have to be able to provide patient access. And as the meaningful use rules come out, you know, stage 2 certainly has more in it about patient access, and stage 3 is going to have even more. Those are not even business hour type things. Those are when your patients want to access their information. And that will clearly at times be outside of your normal business hours. So it truly is becoming that 24-hour has to be up all the time. We don't have the luxury of going to tape or those kinds of things. So that whole evolution has really changed that thinking from disaster recovery to business continuity. Right. So I don't have to read this for you. I mean, basically, though, it's what critical business functions have to happen to make sure that our customers don't recognize that there is some kind of a hiccup on our end. And what are those core activities that it would take to make that happen, right? So it starts at the very bottom of this diagram. It starts with a lot of planning and consulting. You have to have internal plans, and then if you need assistance from the outside, you go get it. You got to understand how to protect your assets. You know, you have to have the appropriate things in place, whether it's internal or external to your organization, to keep things going up. What are you going to do to operationally recover? If your building is sitting beside the river out in Pierre or Fort Pierre, and you suddenly are going to be knowing that there's a flood coming, where are you moving your operations to? Where do your people come to work tomorrow morning in the event of a tornado? Where do you go? How do they get access? What does your calling tree look like? All of the things that need to happen to really understand operational recovery. And so, you know, even sometimes as simple as the porta potty example I used earlier. Okay, so I can gather all my people in one location. What are my physical facilities for these people to do any kind of work? All needs to be planned out. So what things can you avoid bringing up initially? What things are absolutely vital to be brought up from the very beginning? How do you move that forward and become fully functional? Really becomes a part of understanding first what it takes to be functional, and then bring in what other things has to happen. And once you start to do that, and you start to generate being able to access things that are local to you, and also be able to access things that may not be local to you, but access them in a way that means you could be mobile. You could work from another location, and all you have to do basically is turn the switch. You don't have to haul servers. You don't have to move stuff. You don't have to do all those things. It really helps your planning process to know that you have resources that are shareable from organizations. So so that was kind of the history lesson a little bit. Let's talk some about what's affecting high availability today. Certainly the cloud, you hear that, the cloud, and essentially that's distributed applications. I mean, that's what that's all about, is distributing failure points, moving a failure point from a single point of failure out. The further you do that, you have to be able to protect those things, but that can be done. People across the world are doing things, and you may have the feeling, well, I'm a small healthcare provider in South Dakota, when the reality is your patients travel all over the world, and there could be a very pressing need for somebody to be able to make communication about a family member who's still in the area or whatever, and that happens all over the world. That happens. I mean, it really forces that 24/7 operation. So, as a healthcare provider, more so than almost any other industry, you have a need to have that application available all the time. In the security field, we talk a lot about availability, integrity, and confidentiality, and we spend an awful lot of time in healthcare talking about confidentiality above all else. But availability and integrity of that data are far more important than the confidentiality is. Yes, you could get yourself in some trouble by leaking information, but not having the information, or worse yet, having incorrect information, is much more damaging to a patient. So that 100% application availability is important. It's time to kind of start thinking about this, and this is where that trend has all been leading to, is that continuous computing instead of disaster recovery. So what kinds of things can you be doing now that just to ensure resiliency? Disaster resiliency is important as you look forward in your planning efforts. Where will you be in 5 years? Where will you be in 10 years? What kinds of things can we be doing now so that we're sure that we are resilient in our business continuity plan, right? So that may mean a shift, a fundamental shift from hardware and software to virtualization or cloud computing or whatever it would take, so that you are not doing disaster recovery in the traditional sense of, let's go get a backup tape from the bank vault, install it on a cold iron system that maybe doesn't match the existing configuration of the server that I have. How do I rebuild the operating system on the new hardware first? How long does that take? All those become very important questions to you when the lights go out, so to speak. So we won't spend much time on this. I think there's a couple of real important points on here. You need to understand that every minute your business is down, it's costing someone something, and you need to just understand how long you can afford to wait to get your operations back up and running. And notice I'm not saying data systems here, I'm saying operations. How can you make sure that you're able to do the things you need to do operationally, and what impact does that have? How quickly can you recover, and those kinds of things. All important to think about. It starts with forming a committee or something, getting some people to talk about this issue, and really starting to understand that. So there are a lot of new things on the market, and I'll actually leave most of those to Brian to talk about. But what we're talking about here is, if there is a disaster, what things do you need to do to be able to meet your legal and regulatory issues? What things do you have to do? How do you minimize the impact of that disaster on your business? And you do that, quite frankly, through managing your business continuity plans and the processes that surround that. So this sounds a little bit daunting. I understand that, but there are ways to divide and conquer that. You have that traditional backup, which is doing the tape, doing the recovery from disk. Whether it's a storage area network or a network attached storage device or whatever it is. There's kind of those more traditional types of backup. And it should be noted again, like we noted earlier, that is not the same thing as replication or disaster recovery. Because if you take a tape and you've been backing up all of the data to that tape, you have to have an operating system to load that to. So in a true disaster, if the building is on fire and you have to start from scratch, you have to get hardware, you have to have operating systems installed, you have to ensure that it's the same kind of thing that might have the same types of drivers on it. There's a lot of pieces to this. So replication in a disaster recovery mode is different than that traditional backup. And part of that difference is that bare metal recovery. What do we have to do if I have to go out and order new hardware from a vendor at the same time everybody else in my area is ordering new hardware? Are my supply lines shortened or are they lengthened? You know, is the time to get hardware in even feasible, or am I driving from Ipswich to Sioux Falls to pick up hardware at Best Buy because it's my only available option? What kinds of things do we have to do to make sure that we can start from the bottom? So with that, I want to turn it over to Brian Mitchell, and when I turn it over to Brian, I should let you know that we have heard providers in South Dakota say that we would love to have an option here a little bit closer to home. So as the Regional Extension Center, we went out to RFP, and we looked for an organization that could do a good job for us in terms of disaster recovery, and we frankly were so pleased that they were able to come up and give us, Clear Data was able to give us a proposal. They won the RFP. They really are doing some phenomenal things in healthcare and cloud applications. So I'd just like to welcome Brian to the presentation and to let everybody know that's listening that they clearly are a valued partner of ours in South Dakota and moving forward. So, Brian?
Okay, I think I had a little bit of a muting problem myself there, Dan. I had a hard time releasing it. But, you know, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for having me here today, because this is a really important topic. I've been talking about disaster recovery and then evolving into the conversation of disaster avoidance, which really results in business continuity, and that's what we need to have sustainable businesses, viable businesses going forward. And I'm thrilled, and I'm speaking for my company as well, to be partnering with your Regional Extension Center and any of you who care to do so with us, to help you with that sustainability and viability through providing additional security and options regarding business continuity. And in addition to that, of course, the expediency and quality of care, which are so important for all of us. So thanks again for this opportunity. I have I once heard Rudy Giuliani say you can never be too prepared for a topic. So I have about 3 hours worth of stuff that we're going to get to in about 15 minutes. So I'll talk as quickly as I can and get us there so that we can get to some question and answer period as well. Dan made great points regarding sort of where we've come from and what the requirement changes have been over the years. The one thing that hasn't changed is the devastation that can take place if we're down. In fact, I shouldn't say it hasn't changed. It's gotten worse over time if you lose your system, because the cost continues to escalate. I've done a lot of these talks, and I ask two questions all the time when I'm talking about business continuity. One of them is, how many of you know how much it costs you to be down for an hour or a day if you have a disaster or a system failure? And I don't know about all of you on the phone, but typically no one dares to raise their hand and give me a guess, but once in a while someone, a brave soul, will, and the numbers that they lay out there because of the research they've done are just astounding. Candidly, I think a lot of the smaller practices would be out of business. It's kind of like the restaurant business. If there's a flood and somebody's they have to close their doors for 4 or 5 days, a lot of them never reopen. And Dan illustrated those points earlier in the presentation. We're on the hairy edge all the time. And I used to go out and talk about, you can't really afford not to have a disaster avoidance plan in place so that you keep your business operating, because it needs to be viable, it needs to be sustainable in that regard. Not to mention the impact on patients, which of course is why we're all in the business to begin with, right? So thank you, Dan, for that background. And I've seen a fair amount of evolution myself since I've been in healthcare now for nearly 20 years. And I ran a group called the Technical Consulting Group at IDX System Corporation and then GE Healthcare. So I've been around a lot of data centers and a lot of disaster recovery discussions. And as I said before, I've done a lot of stumping for disaster recovery and disaster avoidance over the years. What I find, and it's not rocket science, is there's really 3 major components when it comes to disaster recovery, business continuity, or whatever we want to call it. Technology, the services, and the management of it. The technology is evolving rapidly, and it's making it a lot easier for us to more cost effectively provide good business continuity options. The more we develop a plan and try to get to a reduced recovery point objective and recovery time objective, typically it costs more money. We all know that. That's not a secret. But now with the technology that's available, the network connectivity, the security over lines, remote hosting capabilities such as what we provide, that cost continues to be reduced, and it gives us a lot more options to work with. Services are a huge part of that as well. It's important to have the right services for the right time, for the right options that you're looking for, to not only recover but also to avoid that disaster in the first place. And then management of a disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan is really important. Not only the actual infrastructure that's in place or the processes that are in place, but also the dynamics, the changing dynamics of what the requirements are also really important. Any plan needs to be a dynamic plan, right? It has to be updated on a regular basis, has to be kept current so that it's in lockstep with what the business requirements are. And so that's why this management of that plan is so very, very important. So there are several ways to avoid disaster recovery and interruption. And when you look at this little circle, this wheel that we have, it's kind of like a wheel of success for management solutions. They include 3 things: the planning part, the protection component that comes out of the planning, and then the recovery if you need to recover. And the planning and the protection part are meant to avoid having to go to recovery. But the recovery has to be there if you plan on continuing your business operation, because if something does happen that wipes you out, that the protection that you have in place locally doesn't shield you from having to recover, then you have to be able to recover. And so that's important to have that in place. So first of all, the plan is, you could do assessments. So there's a lot of different business continuity services that are available out there, a lot of so-called experts that can help you with that, or you may have all the expertise in-house to be able to do it. The important part is to build that plan so that it's dynamic and ongoing. It's kind of like a living organism that's evolving and kept up to date. And then the second part of that, of course, is the protection part. And Some of this stuff is pretty straightforward, it's pretty easy, and you can build in a lot of redundancy to your existing systems, whether they be the computers themselves, whether they be the storage components of that, whether it's the power components, and not just the power within the data center, but the power outside of the data center, whether it's generators, it's grids, or all those things that can potentially be redundant. That's important. And of course, encryption is really important if you're transmitting anything over a network. You got to protect PHI. It's a HIPAA requirement if you want to be compliant. And I can tell you, in my business with hosting, that is the #1 factor for us, HIPAA compliance and security, making sure that the data, the PHI never leaves the country, never gets compromised in any way, shape, or form. And then there are a lot of different disaster-tolerant environments that are either through replication or through clustering capabilities that are very helpful. There are some distance limitations we have to be cognizant of, and then of course there's that big 4-letter word called cost, right, that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And we really weigh what Dan has talked about earlier around tolerance and recovery times and all those things against the cost of it to make our final decision, build our final plan, and then build all the things that we have to have in place to keep the business up and running. And the final component, of course, is the recovery from basic backups and how that's handled. And we can never overlook that, because I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of companies in healthcare over the last almost 20 years that backup really wasn't given the right amount of attention. People that didn't know how to do it correctly, didn't do integrity checks on their backup, and then when they went to recover the data, they only had one copy, and it was corrupt, and they were in big trouble. And those things do happen, trust me, and they're still happening today. It's not old news, and you can't make that stuff up anymore, right? So there's a lot of different environments, including the cloud hosting environment, which really gives us another option today. It's very cost effective, and it takes away a lot of that infrastructure planning and requirement and brick and mortar and everything that we have to have in place, because we can move that to someone else who's an expert in that field, and they can become part of what I like to call our virtual team to get this all done effectively. A virtual team really is just pulling in people who focus on a particular area that we need, that we don't have the resources to get effectively, to build effectively. And that's that second question I always ask people, which is, do you have the resources you need to accomplish everything that you need to accomplish? Guess what? When I ask that, when I'm doing these talks around the country, nobody ever raises their hand, because we're all stretched to the limit to try to get more done with less, and that's just part of life today. So what I've always done in my career is try to build virtual teams of experts, not necessarily working in my company. In fact, if you looked out of 8 things that I had to do, at least 6, and sometimes 7 of those 8 things were from outside organizations that I built partnerships with, I planned with, I worked with, and effectively built a team that could provide everything we needed to help our customers be more successful without them being part of my company. So quick look at the plan we've talked about a lot already. A comprehensive plan that ensures recovery, contingency, and testing, and Dan talked about that. And not only the hardware, but the applications, the network, the security, and the processes. Can't overlook that. And guess what? These days, with all the pressure you're getting from government regulation, competitors, whether you're small or large, what's going on around you, processes are going to change. The whole industry is dynamic. Got to stay on top of those things. And then the solutions, of course, that you build out of that are very important. And you can't overlook anything. Everything has to be taken into consideration. So I'm going to move very quickly because we're running quickly out of time. And really, when you're doing planning, there's 3 phases: the assessment, the plan development, the maintenance. We've already talked about that a little bit. And my slides may be jumping ahead of you. I apologize. I'm going to wait for a couple of seconds as we move into the protection stage. And that's really looking at how you keep applications and processes up to specified levels to ensure that systems, infrastructure, and data are all secure at all times. We talked about security and PHI. I'm sure you all know that PHI records are a lot more valuable out on the black market than financial records. And I'm not going to go into all that because it goes into marketing and why people do it and why they spend more money for them and a lot of different ways, a lot of different reasons why. But then, you know, you have to look at the solutions. We've already talked about that, and there are a lot of ways you can accomplish some levels of redundancy, some levels of disaster avoidance, disaster recovery, but the ultimate is as much business continuity as you can get for the right amount of money. So here's a depiction of some of the different layers of protection now. As you look at this, I'm not going to spend any time on this. Dan touched on some of these. The only one I'm going to mention that's really important that we often overlook is bare metal recovery. And that's really restoring your systems all the way down to the system level, having everything from operating system all the way up restored quickly. It's not just a matter of database recovery, it's system recovery, all the parameters and everything else. And sometimes you have to go back and grab CDs, DVDs, or whatever you have to build those. You got to find them if they haven't been destroyed, or you got to go find them off-site, get them and get the systems rebuilt. So recovering bare metal is really, really important and can save a lot of time and a lot of money and potentially lives. Again, we don't have a lot of time here, but disaster-tolerant clusters, there's a lot of different options available today, and it's an ever-increasing amount. It's really how much you want to do, whether it's replication or whether it's a mirrored copy. Mirroring, it takes a larger bandwidth, but it gives you more current data. There's other ways of accomplishing that through replication, through journal files, and moving those over require less bandwidth, less hardware at the other end, and a lot less expensive to do. But it may take you a little bit longer to recover depending on how you do it. And business continuity concepts, really the two things here are whether you're doing cloning or you're doing more of a mirroring type of an application. Whether you're doing full duplication of data or whether you're doing setting up pointers so that you know where to go and how to recover that. This is a snapshot environment which is very usable today because of all the striping capabilities that we have, all the RAID capabilities that we have. So you can do a snapshot which really sets up pointers to go find the data and recover it very quickly for you. Again, I'm just scratching the surface here. The recovery piece, again, includes all of the things we've already talked about and more. But it's really maintaining the highest level of recovery point objectives, which is data, where you recover your data, and recovery time objectives, which is the quickest time to recovery. And there are a lot of ways of doing that. You can set up expensive infrastructure at your own remote sites. So you can have your own brick and mortar. You can rent space, or you can go to the cloud. And there are some other things that aren't as expedient, like having quick ship of hardware. Dan already talked about the fact that if a multitude of environments in your area were affected, you're going to be really scrambling to compete for not only the hardware but the people to set it up and get it running again. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration. That's why the cloud hosting today or a long-distance remote data center somewhere else to get to very quickly is really, really important. If you're in Louisiana, I wouldn't ever recommend a disaster recovery site in Alabama or Mississippi. Right? That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, or even Florida, for that matter. So this next slide just looks at a disaster-tolerant SAN. SANs are a big part of this, particularly if you're more local and you're trying to do something, a replication more locally. But the key concept here is at the bottom of the slide: high availability plus disaster avoidance equal business continuity. I talked about that earlier. Very, very important concept. This is what we do, and this is a very high level look at what we do at Clear Data, which protects your applications, your databases, your servers, your storage, in a virtualized environment. So there's economies of scale using the latest technology to virtualize, to secure, and to move data as rapidly as possible so you have reduced latency. Bottom line is secure connections, redundancy, ultra secure compliant along with the HIPAA and beyond NIST standards, and managed by somebody that's all they do. So that's what we do. That's part of that virtual team that helps you with your business success in a more extended fashion. This is just a picture of what we do. It gives you an idea of the redundancy capabilities and really it's a very high level picture of what's out there. If you had to maintain this in your own organization, and you may have some degree of this already, you know how difficult it is. You know how much work it is. You know how expensive and time-consuming to stand it up. Now think about it in these terms. You're going from 6.0 to 6.5 or 9.0 to 9.5 or whatever the version of the application environments you have. A lot of times when you move from one version to another, that requires a forklift upgrade of your hardware. Think of having to change this all out again to create your own high availability environment versus having it in a completely virtualized environment where all you have to do is get your application upgraded. And I can give you examples of customers where it was going to be a 4.5-month process to move to the latest version of a particular application. We did it in 4 days for them. So that's the whole virtual approach. And oh, by the way, we saved them a ton of money, and they perform better than what they performed before. So those are some of the options that are now available that I couldn't talk about in the 90s or even in the first decade of the 2000s that now are available because of hosting capabilities that are out there for us. So this particular screen gives you a look at some of the benefits of a cloud-hosted solution. And it really includes a lot of different things down the left side of your screen, but across the top, different types of environments, including things like vendor-neutral archiving for imaging solutions, whether it's PAC, cardio, radiology information system, or whatever. But then all the archiving and backup, managed services in the data center, and regular cloud hosting of all these different applications, keeping the PHI secure, ensuring HIPAA compliance, in many cases increasing not only uptime but performance, and obviously security better than it's ever been before. So a lot of different functional benefits that are available. And then when you look at the very top line here, reduce cost and turning capital expenditures into operating expenses. Sometimes that's a lot easier for organizations. Most of the healthcare organizations I worked with, getting large capital expenditure was not an easy task. And when you're asked to do more with less all the time, it becomes more and more difficult as time goes on. More of a predictable cost by doing it this way. So, and sometimes it's mountainous lumpy, right, when you have big capital expenditures. So that's a screaming through this as we come near the end of our time. And I'm going to turn this back over now to Dan for some closing remarks. And I just want to say thank you very much. And it was a pleasure being with you here today. And I look forward to working with you in the future because I think there's a lot we can accomplish together. And I'm hopeful that I'll be a part of that. And Dan, I'm trying to turn these slides over to you right now. I'm going to stop showing my screen. And this back over now.
Okay. Yeah, I should have it at this point. Thank you for that. And there was a couple of pieces, you know, as we maybe look at this ask again, where you guys are at in your position. But one thing Brian said that really stood out for me, and I'm not sure I allowed him enough time to really expand on it. That was my fault. I got a little windy there at first. I apologize. Hope I didn't put too many people to sleep before you got on with the meat of it, Brian. But Brian said at one point in the presentation that that's all we do. And I think that's just important for you as providers to understand that one of the real reasons we selected ClearData is they are a HIPAA-compliant environment and they have an exclusive healthcare focus. So they are partnered with a number of EHR vendors and HIE vendors and those kinds of things, and some very big national players, and all they do is healthcare. You know, you don't have to worry about hosting in a cloud with the local furniture store's website, or you don't have to worry about, you know, this is just a commodity piece, so all we're doing is selling megabytes of data, so we can host those in, you know, Guadalajara, Mexico as easily as we can here, and it's way cheaper, so we should do that. So this is healthcare focused only. They're really good at what they do, and you guys can certainly take a look at ClearData and see that. But again, we welcome them as a partner. You know, they bring so many things to the table for us that we were looking for, and that frankly we were passing on to them from you as providers. Some of those things that we heard, well, we'd love to do this, but we want to make sure it's not out in Seattle, or we want to make sure it's in South Dakota. How do we make sure that it's all secure? How do we make sure that I'm a person and a contract, not a number? Those kinds of things are the things that we were asked by providers to really take out and find for a company. And ClearData can provide all those things. So we have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to actually at this point open it up for questions. This is the second time we've done this presentation, so we're certainly willing and able to ask any questions. Last time we didn't have a lot of questions, so I felt pretty comfortable leaving a fairly short amount of time, but we can stay on as long as is necessary. So with that, Jeff, I'd like to open the mics up, and we can field some questions.
Okay. So for everybody on the call right now, the mics are open, and if you have any questions for Dan or Brian, feel free to just speak into your computer and relay those questions on to us. So there's a question, I think, that came in. I'm most concerned about the security of data if our secure information is being sent into the cloud. How do you protect our client data?
Paul, do you want, or sorry, Brian, do you want to answer that question, or you want me to?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd love to. It's data is encrypted in motion and at rest, and everything's a virtual private network. So you have a private connection into our data center when we're hosting an environment. So your data is completely protected end to end, starting with a Brocade switch that's sitting in your environment, encrypted into our data center, and there, when it's sitting on the storage device, it's also encrypted. So it's fully encrypted and protected that way. We do some other things to take additional security measures. The way we set up firewalls and the ports we use, we do a lot of things all the way to trying to delay anybody that's trying to hack in, because we monitor the system 7/24. We can catch people that would try to hack in more easily, more quickly, because we've set up additional defense mechanisms from them even getting into our environment. But encryption is the big thing, end-to-end, and it's virtual private network right into our data center.
So Brian, would it, I guess in layman's terms, would it be fair to say it's similar to, it's not like just unlocking one door and walking into the house, but it would be more like unlocking that front door and then finding out there's an entryway that also has a locked door, which also has an entryway with a locked door, and all along the way those locks are incredibly hard to get into?
Yeah, I would say that's not a bad analogy, Jeff. It's ultra secure. We go beyond any of the NIST standards and HIPAA compliance requirements for security. But that's a great question and a very viable concern. In fact, a survey I saw recently, about 70% of CIOs that responded said their biggest concern was security of the cloud. And candidly, that's why we're in this business, because we have that figured out. And Dan mentioned that we don't do anything other than healthcare, so we're really focused. We've got a certified information protection professional on staff, and that's kind of a rare breed around the world. And this guy drives me nuts because he's ultra conservative in everything that he does. But at the end of the day, that's what we need, and that's why we feel so confident. We'll sign a BAA. We've got people like HP who have brought us in as a cloud agile partner. IBM's working with us. EMC's working with us. They won't take the risk that we're willing to take because of the security of our environment.
And I would just add to that, Brian, having seen the architecture and seen how it works, one of the things you said with that Brocade switch, that's an on-premise switch. That for a customer in the field, they start with that firewall. That's a VPN connection back. It's when Brian talks about data encryption in transit, from the time it leaves your facility to the time it reaches theirs, it's all encrypted traffic, and then it's encrypted at rest. So with Jeff's analogy, I would even maybe take that one step further to say, as you're pulling up to that house, you're shrouded in darkness in some sense. So if you're looking at things from a contractual side with the business associate agreement that they are certainly willing to stand, these folks are best of breed, and it's one of the reasons why we selected them. And there's a whole number of other reasons, but we don't have time to get into them. So.
All right. Any other questions that we might field before we close out this webinar today? That was a great question, by the way. Okay. Well, if you don't have any other questions, here's one. Does Clear Data do anything with failover redundancy?
Yeah, I'll take that, Dan. We do tons.
Sure.
Tons. We do tons, and we provide different options because we work in the imaging space as well as revenue cycle management and electronic health records and exchange and some other areas. We have a lot of different requirements. We have a lot of flexibility, but depending on what you want, you could have full redundancy. For example, say you don't need a production environment. You just want us for disaster recovery. We could have you go into one of our data centers, Chicago, Phoenix, or wherever else it happens to be, or if you're doing imaging and you want multiple copies, we could do that. Or if you want your production environment in one of our data centers and then you want disaster recovery somewhere else, we would have two separate data centers. So we use Vmware products a lot. So we use vMotion for moving data around. We use vShield for protection, and that's just scratching the surface. We use a lot of other different products as well, but we do a ton of failover. And we can set up an environment that's a failover environment where it's more replicated, or we can set up an environment that's more of a mirrored or shadowed or whatever you want to call it environment that's real time, that fails over. And it's really a matter of what you need, how much bandwidth requirements and the costs associated with that you want to have into the environment. So a lot of different options available. But the short answer to the question is absolutely.
All right. All right. Well, just out of respect for time, I think we'll close out today's session. I just want to thank Dan and Brian again for all the information. Thank everyone who was able to attend, and have a great day.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, everybody.